Let's talk about Quran Islam. It's a movement that's stirring up some serious debate. In fact, some critics are calling the focus on the Quran alone a coming disaster. But here's the thing. Proponents say this objection is nothing new. It has ancient roots. They actually draw a direct line from today's critics to the Meccan polytheists. And the Quran records the Prophet's response, "I only follow what's revealed to me." So this gets to the very heart of it. Was the Prophet himself guided by the Quran? Proponents point to verses like this, saying he was guided from ignorance by the book itself. Which leads them to ask a really pointed question to their opponents. Who was the first Quran Muslim? Their answer? The Prophet Muhammad himself. Okay, so this whole view forces a really clear line between the Quran and Hadith. The Quran is seen as divine and certain. Hadith? Well, that's human and conjectural. And they argue that blurring this line is dangerous. It leads to accepting fabricated beliefs. Take this famous narration, for example, which is often presented as a sacred hadith. Their refutation? It makes God dependent on a human. They say that's a total fabrication. And this is how a clergy class gets created, they claim, by elevating human figures. You see the pattern, right? The book is too hard, so scholars become essential gatekeepers. And what's the result? Division. So many sects, all following different human leaders. But the biggest pushback is always this. The Quran is just too complex for regular people. Adherents fire back by quoting the Quran itself, which says it was made easy to understand. And get this, that exact same phrase is repeated 4 times in the very same chapter. They see this as a divine promise. The book is accessible to anyone who seeks guidance. The Quran even asks, isn't this book enough for you? It presents itself as sufficient. So for this movement, the solution to all the confusion is simple. Just return to the source. And that means rejecting intermediaries and engaging directly with the book to find unity. Which leaves us with a final lingering question. If the book is for everyone, why build walls? Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a pretty intense theological debate that's happening within Islam. And it all comes down to one big question. What are the real sources of the faith? So the source we're looking at today kicks things off with a really, really stark accusation. It's aimed at this growing movement, and its critics aren't just saying it's wrong. No, they're calling it a full-blown disaster. So you have to ask, right? Why would a movement that's all about focusing on the Quran get labeled something so extreme? Well, that question, that's the key. It sets up the central conflict we're going to unpack today. It's a battle over who or what has the final say in the religion. All right, so let's get right into the heart of this accusation. The source makes it clear this isn't some dusty academic debate happening in ivory towers. Nope. This is bubbling up from the ground, you know? It's regular people who are starting to pick up the Quran and use it as their own personal yardstick. They're trying to figure out, okay, what's actually divine religion and what's just cultural tradition that we've piled on over the centuries. Now, it's really important to get how the people in this movement see it. They'll tell you this isn't some new trendy thing. They're not trying to invent a new Islam. For them, it's the exact opposite. They see it as hitting the reset button, a restoration project, if you will. They're trying to get back to the original foundation of the faith, before, in their view, anything else got added.
And to back this up, the source makes a really bold claim. It argues that the very first Quran Muslim, the original one, was the Prophet Muhammad himself. The logic they present is pretty straightforward. Before the revelation started, he wasn't a prophet. So what made him a Muslim? The Quran. It was the Quran and only the Quran that guided him into his faith and his prophethood.
Okay, so this is where we get to the real heart of the disagreement. It's not just about which book you prefer. It's about the very nature of the texts themselves. It all boils down to a massive difference between what's considered absolutely certain and what's seen as, well, basically human guesswork. So first up is this idea called Tedbiryay. Now, think of it like this. How do we know World War II happened? It's not because we read one person's diary. It's because millions of people witnessed it, and it was passed down through so many different channels that it's just a fact. It's an undisputed collective certainty. And the argument here is that the Quran was passed down in that exact same way, making its text an absolute rock-solid truth. And then, on the complete other end of the spectrum, you have zan, which basically means conjecture or speculation. This is more like that game of telephone, where a story is passed from one person to the next to the next.
The final message depends entirely on the memory and the honesty of every single person in that chain. And because of that, its authenticity is always going to be speculative, right? Not absolute. And this is where you can really see the battle lines being drawn. On one side, we've got the Quran, which is presented as the direct, certain, divine word of God. But on the other side, you have the Hadith collections, the sayings and actions of the Prophet. From this perspective, those are framed as human narrations, and that means they fall into that conjecture category. For folks who follow Quranic Islam, this isn't just some minor detail. Man, this is everything. It's the absolute bedrock of their entire way of thinking. So then, proponents of this view draw a really fascinating parallel. They point to this verse from the Quran, where the Meccan polytheists came to the Prophet and said, "Hey, bring us a different Quran, or just change this one." The argument they're making is that critics today who demand other religious sources besides the Quran are basically asking for the same thing. It's like they're saying, God's word isn't enough on its own. You need to add some human stuff to it.
Okay, so to make this point less theoretical and a lot more real, the source shifts gears. It moves away from just talking about ideas and starts pointing to specific examples of narrations that are attributed to the Prophet, narrations that it flat out calls fabrications. Now, the reason for showing these examples is to make a really critical point. The argument from the Quran-centric perspective is that when narrations like these, which again they see as totally made up, are treated like scripture, it does more than just distort the faith. It fundamentally changes the prophet's role from a human messenger into, well, something else entirely. And this leads to what is probably the most provocative claim in the entire source. The accusation is that elevating the prophet through these other texts isn't just about showing respect or honor. No, the argument is that it's a calculated move, a strategy designed specifically to take the ultimate authority away from the book, the Quran, and place it onto a person instead. And to really drive this point home, the source makes a pretty controversial comparison to early Christianity. It argues that we've seen this playbook before. The claim is that by elevating a person to a divine-like status, you can effectively sideline the original holy book. And what happens then? Well, you create a need for a special class of interpreters, a clergy, who then become the gatekeepers to the faith. It's a sharp critique, basically saying that history is just repeating itself. So the big pushback from the Quran-centric side is that this whole system of intermediaries and gatekeepers isn't just a problem, it's completely unnecessary. And for their proof, where do they go? Straight back to the Quran itself. They point to verses like this one. And what's interesting is that this specific line is repeated over and over in the same chapter. For them, this is like God putting it in bold letters. The book was made to be easy to understand. It was designed to be accessible, not some cryptic code that only a few experts can crack. And that raises a pretty powerful common sense question, doesn't it? The logic is simple. If the people who first heard the Quran, illiterate desert Arabs in the 7th century, could understand its core message, why on earth would it be too complicated for educated people to understand today? It directly challenges the whole idea that you need a gatekeeper to understand the book. And that question really cuts right to the chase, It puts the entire structure of traditional religious authority under a microscope. It forces you to ask, is this whole system of experts and scholars something God demanded, or is it something that people build over time? So, in the end, this whole massive debate that we've walked through, it all comes down to this one single question, a question of authority. It's a profound challenge, really, asking every believer to think about the very foundation they're standing on. Whose word defines your faith? Is it God's word, or is it the words of men?
This is The Brief on the discourse surrounding the defense of Quran-centric Islam. So we're diving into the pushback against modern critics, the ones who claim that focusing only on the Quran is some kind of catastrophic deviation. We're going to look at why the divine book has always been, and still is, the sole sufficient guide. First, the core argument is that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was himself the very first Quran Muslim. I mean, think about it. He became the messenger and received his entire guidance through the Quran and only the Quran. The ancient polytheists, the mushriks, didn't object to him personally. They objected to the divine message itself because it fundamentally threatened their corrupt system, the Jahiliyyah, or the age of ignorance. Second, and this is crucial, that historical opposition has a modern parallel. Today's critics, who the sources call Kodamanlar, basically the powerful establishment, the bigwigs, they oppose a Quran-first belief because they benefit from the other systems. They're afraid a return to the Quran's pure power will dismantle the contemporary Jahiliyyah and cut off their base of influence. And finally, these critics actively try to undermine the Quran by promoting fabricated sayings. For example, there's the false saying, love lake, love lack, which claims, if not for you, I would not have created the universes. It's completely illogical, right? God created the prophet. These fabrications are just used to deify human figures and divert attention from the divine word. So the defense of a Quran-centric Islam really rests on one question, straight from Surah Ankabut. Is it not enough for them that we have sent down to you the book which is recited to them?
Welcome back to The Deep Dive, where we take your source material, the complex articles, the academic papers, the theological disputes, and transform them into clear, actionable, and fascinating knowledge. I'm your guide to the material, and today we are plunging into an intellectual and religious conflict that is really reshaping the contours of modern Islamic thought.
It really is. It's a high-stakes, internal debate focusing on the ultimate question of religious authority. Our topic today is a deep dive into the contemporary movement known as Quran Islam or Quran Islam.
Right. And this movement asserts that the Quran must be the sole, sufficient, and foundational source of faith and practice.
And that word soul is really the explosive part.
Exactly. And our mission today is urgent. The scholars that are featured in our sources, they're not just, debating theology in a quiet room. They are on the receiving end of some intense institutional resistance.
Oh, absolutely. We're going to unpack the robust theological basis for their stance, but I think it's just as important, maybe more so, to analyze the intensity and the sheer personal nature of the critique that's being leveled against them.
We're talking about the established authorities feeling fundamentally threatened.
Fundamentally. And to set the scene, let's just start with the language being deployed, because it's designed not to invite discussion, but to shut it down completely.
How so?
The critics aren't using academic terms, they're using language of existential fear. They describe this Quran-centric movement as a calamity coming.
A calamity, wow.
Or they call it an aberration, a perversion. The Turkish word is sapıklığı. And that terminology, you see, it implies that the proponents aren't just wrong, but that they are spiritually dangerous, a threat to the faith itself.
That is heavy language. But what really underscores the existential threat they seem to perceive is this specific demand that we see referenced in the sources.
This part is just incredible.
We have figures calling for people who adhere to this view to be rejected outright, even if they can read and cite 500 verses of the Quran. Think about that for a second.
It's astounding, isn't it?
Your ability to quote the scripture is irrelevant if you disagree with the established method of interpretation.
It signals that this isn't about devotion to the text. Not at all. It's about loyalty to the interpretation and the human systems that have been built up around it over centuries.
Right.
So when advocating for the primary scripture is viewed as a coming catastrophe, you know that the established framework is built on something other than the sufficiency of the book itself. The status quo is deeply, deeply invested in maintaining control over interpretation.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Why is the simple act of returning to the Quran and testing everything against it so threatening? What is it about this process that causes such profound discomfort among these traditional authorities?
Well, according to the proponents of Quran Islam, the discomfort arises because when people begin to use the Quran as the ultimate filter, they naturally start to do something very dangerous to the establishment.
Which is?
They start separating the true religion of the Lord from what they call a fabricated religion. They start asking critical questions.
Like, does this practice, this hierarchy, this teaching, actually align with the original, unadulterated divine message?
Exactly that. And the moment that critical separation begins, they argue, the existing power structures, which the speakers in our source material label the system of modern jahiliyyah, or modern ignorance.
A very loaded term.
A very loaded term. But they argue that this system starts to lose its spiritual grip on people.
Precisely. This rediscovery is framed as a kind of spiritual revolution. It immediately undercuts the influence of these modern-day big shots that Quranic.
Right. And these are the figures who, in the view of these scholars, profit immensely from systems designed to keep people spiritually dependent. These systems essentially enslave the populace.
How? By requiring what?
Intermediaries.
Intermediaries, complex rules, hidden knowledge that's only accessible through a religious elite. The whole apparatus. So if the ordinary believer can suddenly access the divine source directly without a gatekeeper.
Then the entire institutional architecture that relies on that spiritual dependency just collapses.
It collapses. And
Yep.
that gives the conflict a clear economic and political dimension, not just a theological one.
And this leads us perfectly to the historical parallel they draw, which I think is one of the most powerful arguments in the sources.
Oh, absolutely. The incident detailed in Yunus Surah, Ayat 15, they suggest this single verse perfectly encapsulates the entire modern crisis.
So what happened in that verse?
It's the definitive parallel.
Yep.
The sources remind us that when the Prophet Muhammad first began reciting the verses of the Quran clearly and directly to the polytheists, the Mushrikler, their response was incredibly telling.
They didn't just say, we don't believe in God. Not at all. They demanded something specific. They said, bring another Quran, or, and this is the crucial phrase, change this one.
And the key insight here, which we really need to dwell on, is that this demand wasn't about seeking theological proof or debating metaphysics. It was a request for concessions.
Cavies. Yes. The polytheistic leaders of Mecca had a very well-established social and economic order. It was built on idolatry, controlling the pilgrims, usury, rigid social hierarchies.
A whole system.
A whole system. And the divine message of the Quran was radical precisely because it demanded the abolition of their entire established order.
It preached equality, condemned usury.
It destroyed the economic power base built around the idols. They didn't want to abolish their entire world for a book, so they asked for the message to be made softer, more flexible, more human, you could say. Secularized.
So they wanted a few verses added, a few taken away.
Just enough compromise so that the Quran wouldn't fundamentally tear down their existing system of ignorance. They wanted to integrate the new faith without disrupting the old power structure.
But the Prophet's response, as cited in that same verse, Yunus 15, it establishes the absolute nature of the revelation, doesn't it?
It's the firewall. It's the absolute non-negotiable rejection. The Prophet responded, I cannot change it on my own initiative. I only follow what is revealed to me. I fear the torment of the great day if I disobey my Lord.
And that moment unequivocally establishes that the messenger is bound by the message. His authority is derived from and strictly limited to the conveyance of that revelation.
He is the postman, not the author of the letter.
So the Quran's Islamic scholars argue that the modern demand of the Quran is not enough, that it needs supplementary human content to be functional.
Is simply the 21st century echo of that mushrik request for concession.
It's the same demand. Change this book.
Exactly. When critics today insist that you require hundreds of thousands of additional narratives, these Rivietler, the Hadith collections, or the sacred books of sacred personalities to complete the divine guidance, they are subtly echoing that same request for another book or a changed book.
They're implying that the original divine word is incomplete or inadequate or just too difficult for our modern age, and thus it needs the human element, the cultural artifact, to make it palatable or functional.
What's fascinating here is how the source material just flips the accusation right back at them. It suggests that those who claim the Quran is insufficient are the ones standing in theological solidarity with the polytheists who sought to dilute the message.
Not the other way around.
Not the other way around. They argue that the established authorities recognize the inherent irresistible power of the Quran. They know that if the masses return to its pure revolutionary state, it will destroy the contemporary systems of dependence.
Just as it destroyed the Jahiliyyah system 14 centuries ago.
Right. So the fear of losing that control is what fuels this entire chorus of abuse and slander aimed at the proponents. They are literally fighting for the survival of their interpretation system.
That context of the Prophet's role as merely the conveyor, bound by the book, leads us to the second massive pillar of the proponents' argument, defining the Prophet Muhammad's own status. They challenge the accepted narrative of how he gained his influence.
And they do this by asking a very fundamental question. What made Muhammad a prophet and a messenger? Was it his own internal knowledge, his wisdom, his oratory skills, or was it the content of the revelation itself?
And sources immediately refute the idea that he became influential through his own brilliance.
Right. They argue that if the prophet had simply been using his own words or his poetry, which he was known to excel at, The mushrikun might have negotiated with him, respected him as a wise man, or, even elevated him to some local leadership position.
But they wouldn't have feared him the way they did.
They feared the content. They feared the Ilahi message, the divine message, because it wasn't negotiable and it wasn't human-derived. It fundamentally overturned their entire kahiliya system, the system of ignorance built on intermediaries, the objectification of women, the enslavement of the weak.
And that divine message, the source states with some dramatic emphasis, sowed the seed of destruction for that entire coercive, oppressive structure.
The phrase used is kukunit kiblus suyu ekti. It poured acid on its roots.
Wow. And to drive this point home, the scholars turned to specific Quranic references that establish the prophet's profound dependence on the revelation. This is to counter the later, more popularized narratives that suggest he was somehow intrinsically divine or pre-existing.
And this is where their scriptural analysis gets its sharpest. They cite Shura 52, a verse that is so often overlooked in popular culture, but is absolutely central to their argument.
What does it say?
Thus, we have revealed to you a spirit of our command, the Quran. You did not know what the book was, nor what faith was. But we made it a light by which we guide whom we will of our servants.
That statement is just.
Yeah.
It's utterly profound, isn't it? You did not know what the book was, nor what faith was.
The implication is unavoidable. The Prophet Muhammad himself, prior to the revelation, was unguided in the spiritual sense concerning the divine path.
He's guided by the book.
He was guided by the book. He didn't arrive knowing the answers. The answers came to him through the book. This totally demolishes any idea that the prophet possessed some kind of celestial self-sufficient knowledge that existed before or parallel to the Quran.
He received the light. He wasn't the source of the light.
Exactly. And they back this up with Qisas 8586, which further emphasizes this element of surprise in the revelation.
Which says what?
Indeed, he who has made the Quran incumbent upon you will surely return you to the promised place. Say, my Lord knows best who brings guidance and who is in manifest error. You were not expecting that this book would be sent down to you. It was only a mercy from your Lord.
You are not expecting that this book would be sent down to you. I mean, that is a direct internal Quranic rebuttal of the later mythologies, isn't it?
It is the scriptural bullet against the later manufactured sayings like the mystical levlak that we'll discuss shortly, which retroactively insert this celestial awareness into the prophet's story. The Quran itself states he did not anticipate the revelation.
It was a pure mercy, a gift.
A gift that redirected him from error to guidance. Dalat and Hidayat.
So, if the Quran was the light that guided the prophet, and if he had no prior knowledge of the book or faith until it was revealed to him, the conclusion drawn by these scholars is logically necessary.
The Prophet Muhammad himself was the first Quran Muslim.
He was the first person to receive, submit to, and implement the Quran as his singular source of guidance.
That is the cornerstone of their entire position.
And this is where they return that initial accusation of deviation of sapakluk right back onto the critics. Because if the Prophet was the first Quran Muslim, then calling Quran Muslimhood an aberration is fundamentally what?
It's a massive slander,
Yeah.
a bhutan. It becomes an implicit accusation of deviation against the Prophet himself.
You're saying the path he took was flawed?
The critics are essentially stating that the path the Prophet took, which was solely reliant on the Quran for guidance, is flawed and aberrant. The scholars argue that if you cannot accept the sufficiency of the book for the Prophet himself, you cannot be accepting of the Prophet's mission. It's the ultimate logical trap for the traditionalists.
So the moment you introduce a parallel source of authority, you run this risk of displacing the original divine text. The scholars drive this point home by drawing a direct, and to some, probably a shocking historical parallel involving Christianity.
It is a powerful warning shot. They compare the elevation of hadith and other texts in Islam to the historical fate of the gospel, the bisil. They argue that the process of turning a prophet or messenger into a deified figure and thereby sidelining the actual revelation he brought, well, it happened historically with Jesus.
And who do they blame for initiating this displacement in that context?
They point specifically to Paul's influence, particularly within his letters, like those to the Corinthians. They claim Paul's writings elevated Jesus to a cosmological principle, the cause of creation.
A concept they see mirrored directly in the later Islamic idea of Nuri Muhammadi, the Mohammedan light.
Exactly. And this act of deification, they argue, it turned Jesus into the revelation itself, or Wahi. And by doing that, the divine book that was revealed to Jesus became secondary.
That's a crucial distinction. The divine book was meant for Jesus and the people, but the man himself became the primary object of worship and the source of knowledge.
And what replaced the divine scripture in that framework?
Human notes, narratives.
Human notes, narratives, and observations, which the source speakers explicitly equate to hadith or durma fabrication. The writings of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are Siyar-like biographical narratives written decades later, they became the primary source for understanding Jesus, and they effectively replaced the divine book that Jesus actually conveyed.
And the justification for accepting these human-authored texts often rested on claims of what? Visions?
Extraordinary visions or spiritual discoveries, karamat or quiche. Subjective experience trumped the objective text.
Okay, so let's bring this back to the Islamic context. The scholars are arguing that the exact same historical mechanism has played out in Islam, creating these parallel scriptures.
Yes. They argue that sayings attributed to the Prophet, especially those that lack definitive authenticity, created a second book, and even a third book, these parallel kitaplar.
And this proliferation of human-generated texts systematically sidelines the Quran. It makes it seem inaccessible or incomplete without the supplement.
And this isn't just limited to hadith. They extend the critique to the sanctification of works by influential post-classical scholars or contemporary community leaders, the Simat Underlarinen.
They name specific examples, don't they? Like Rumi's Mesnevi and Said Nursi's Risales.
They do. And the theological issue here is the elevation of the commentary over the source. They argue that if you claim a scholar's work, like the Risales, is the ultimate miracle of the Quran, then the miracle becomes functionally more important, more necessary, and more engaging than the Quran itself.
And they even recount a story about that.
Yeah. A shocking confession from a follower who admitted they found the Quran's meaning too dry compared to the excitement and the detail of the secondary texts. And that, right there, is the moment when cultural artifacts eclipse the divine word.
This transition leads directly to their fierce attack on specific, non-Quranic sayings that promote this kind of deification. Let's look closely at Levlak.
Levlak, lama halaka flak. If not for you, I would not have created the heavens. The scholars label this a clear fabrication, an udurma, possibly inherited from the very Christian traditions they just criticized, and they just dissect its logical flaw.
So what is the theological poison in that statement, specifically for the concept of monotheism or tawhid?
The poison is the concept of contingency. The statement asserts that God's act of creation, khalaq, was contingent upon the prophet's prior necessary existence.
But if God created the prophet,
Exactly. How could the creator's ultimate singular plan depend on the created? It fundamentally inverts the creator-created relationship. It turns the prophet into a divine precondition, suggesting that the entire universe was an afterthought based on the prophet, rather than a direct act of God's singular will.
it undermines God's absolute singularity and turns the focus of creation onto the messenger.
Precisely. And they apply a very similar analysis to Kuntukens, which is a foundation of so much Sufi thought.
Kutukens, which is
I was a hidden treasure, I loved to be known, so I created existence. This is labeled a fabrication of a fabrication, Udurmanyan Udurmasa, and the bedrock of Sufism, the Sufufun Temel Akidelerinden. But the problem here isn't just the content, which they dispute, but the methodology used to justify it.
right. How was this knowledge supposedly gained?
Well, the source claims that the proponents of these ideas, the Mutasawwifs, the Sufis, often justify their core beliefs by saying they received the knowledge directly from the prophet or from God in a dream, Riyad al-Duk, or through divine inspiration, ilm, or spiritual discovery, kash, or karamat.
And this is the methodological crisis.
This is it. You are taking experiential, subjective, or dream-based knowledge and giving it the same or even higher authority as the definitive, objective, and preserved textual revelation of the Quran.
So they're overturning the established methodology of knowledge in Islam, where the Quran is the undisputed, absolute source.
Yes. If you allow subjective dreams to dictate core metaphysical tenets, like why God created the universe in the first place, you have effectively sidelined the Quran as the ultimate judge of truth. You are prioritizing conjecture over certainty.
This section then turns truly visceral when they address the narratives that are intended to sanctify the prophet's person beyond all comprehension. The scholars refer to these as ethically disgusting errands.
They object fiercely to them. These are narratives that claim people drank the prophet's urine and went to heaven, or that the prophet's feces smelled of musk. Their condemnation is that these stories are not acts of reverence.
They're the opposite.
They are the greatest evil that can be done to the prophet.
And why are they the greatest evil? What's the logic there?
Because they transform the prophet from a profound moral guide and a conveyor of divine law into an impossible cult object built on bodily mythology. These fabrications turn the prophet into a figure of potential ridicule, and they utterly humiliate his true mission.
His core job was the conveyance of the book, the teaching of wisdom, the application of justice.
And to distract from that essential duty with these ridiculous, invented bodily myths is, to the proponents of Quran Islam, a deeply disrespectful and damaging act against the legacy of the messenger. It just clouds the true meaning of his entire mission.
Carrying this theme of deification forward, the scholars point out that this problem is not limited to historical hadith. It persists today, right now, through the theological error of hulu akadisi.
The belief in incarnation, the belief that God can enter or manifest in a human body.
That is a radical claim to make against modern religious leaders. What specific claims are they referencing?
They cite extreme anecdotes, like a contemporary leader claiming, quote, Allah manifested in one of our brothers, or the specific chilling saying, I took the form of flesh and appeared as Mahmud.
That is theological dynamite. In those circles, such a belief is often used to justify what? The absolute unquestioning authority of the leader.
Exactly. He becomes the spiritual intermediary or even a manifestation of the divine essence itself.
But the Quran has a clear physical and historical refutation of this concept, doesn't it? Dating all the way back to the time of Moses in Araf 143.
The source uses Araf 143 as the definitive scriptural barrier against hulu. When Moses requested of God, show me yourself that I may look at you, God's reply was absolute. Lent Tarani, ya Musa, you shall never see me, Moses.
And to demonstrate the impossibility,
God manifested a mere fraction of his glory to the mountain, and the mountain was instantly pulverized. Moses fainted.
And the implication for the modern claim is devastatingly simple. If the mountain was destroyed merely by the manifestation,
Then why do the current religious leaders who claim God has manifested in them remain standing? The scholars hold up this inconsistency as proof that these claims are lies and theological heresy. They are challenging the physical reality of the claim against the documented reality of divine power in the Quran.
and they tie this error back to ethics, emphasizing the case of repentance, or tawbah.
Right. Moses repented merely for asking to see God. He confessed, I repent to you, and I am the first of the believers. So the scholars argue that if Moses repented for merely asking, how much more should contemporary leaders who claim to have experienced divine manifestation in their bodies repent for their gross presumption and theological error?
This discussion of lying about God's nature is a direct segue into the final part of this section, the personal, slanderous attacks that are leveled against the Quran proponents. They argue that theological falsehood begets ethical misconduct.
Yes. The speakers emphasize that anyone who is willing to fabricate stories about the prophet, like that ridiculous Hiri reward for killing a lizard, or lie about God's manifestation, the Ticelli,
That person will have absolutely no hesitation in lying and slandering their fellow Muslims when it's convenient.
they see it as a consistent moral failing. It stems from prioritizing human authority over divine truth.
And the sources detail one specific contemporary controversy involving the translation of Surah Abbas, targeting one of the movement's leading scholars, Mustafa Islamolu. What was the exact accusation?
The opponents claimed this scholar allegedly translated the text in a way that called the prophet an arrogant man, Kibirli Adam, which of course is designed to outrage the public and paint the scholar as disrespectful of the prophet.
So how do the scholars defending him dismantle this accusation?
They point to the meticulous detail in the translation itself. The colleague's footnote clearly and explicitly identifies the arrogant man who is described in the opening verses of Surah Abbas.
And it wasn't the prophet.
It was Walid bin Mughira, a well-known leader of the Mushrikun. This man was present during a revelation, and he was the one who frowned and turned away when the blind, poor Muslim Abdullah ibn Maktum interrupted his private discussion with the prophet.
So the opponent is willfully ignoring the contextual clues and the explicit footnote that separates the prophet from the pagan leader.
That is the core of the attack. It's called a vile game, an ashalik oyun. The opponent deliberately skips over the footnote, ignores the known historical context, the sababi nuzul, and just cherry-picks the phrase to manufacture a lie.
The goal being to discredit the proponent of Quran Islam and confirm their bias that these scholars hate the prophet.
And the source speakers conclude that this behavior is symptomatic. It confirms the nature of their opponents as people who lie about God and his messenger, and who cannot control their deceit.
And the irony is quite sharp here, isn't it? The speaker defends his colleague against the accusation of disrespect from a critic who himself promoted the idea that the prophet is enjoying himself in the grave with his wives, a sanctified myth we discussed earlier.
It makes the critique seem completely hypocritical and rooted in malice rather than any genuine piety.
Okay, given the intensity of the critique, especially the attacks on Hadith and Sufism, it's crucial to clarify the methodological stance of the Quran Islam proponents. Yeah. Are they fundamentally anti-tradition? Are they just against Hadith, Tasawwuf, or Fiqh? Because that seems to be the charge leveled against them.
And the scholars address this head-on. They label that accusation as logically absurd. They say being against Hadith is like being against history or against economics. These are vast fields of human effort, and no sane intellectual person could simply reject them out of hand.
So the debate is not about rejection versus acceptance. It's about classification and authority. Where do you place these sources on the spectrum of religious authority?
Exactly. This is the core distinction. Din, which is religion, the divine, unchangeable source, versus kultur kurumlari, cultural institutions, human effort, and historical artifacts.
So Hadith literature, Tasawwuf, Seer, biography, and Fiqh jurisprudence
Are not considered divine sources or din. They are historical and cultural products.
Let's define culture as they do, because it's key to their argument.
Culture is defined as the total sum of material and spiritual values created by human hands. And they highlight that even defining bodies like the Encyclopedia Britannica often specify that culture is everything, excluding religious values. The moment you define it that way, you realize the source material for these cultural institutions is human effort, interpretation, synthesis not direct, primary revelation.
And this is where their archaeology analogy becomes incredibly useful for the listener.
It perfectly illustrates the necessary separation. They say, if you are an archaeologist and you excavate a field and you uncover a polytheistic religious object, a cultural relic of that land, what do?
You clean it, you catalog it, you study it to understand the heritage and history of the people. You place it in a museum.
Right. But you do not, under any circumstances, feel compelled to worship it or make it part of your current religious practice.
The danger is when you make that leap, mistaking the artifact for the divine source.
And if one takes a cultural artifact, such as Tasawwuf, and elevates it to the status of din, of divine religion, they are committing the error of worshiping the artifact. And this is particularly dangerous, they argue, because Tasawwuf emerged centuries after the Prophet, and it incorporated a wide, heterogeneous array of foreign spiritual elements.
What specific external elements do they cite as having been incorporated into the structure of Tasawwuf?
The sources are very specific on this. They list elements of Greek philosophy, Plato and Plotinus's ideas on the soul and emanation, shamanism, Brahmanism, especially concepts of oneness with the divine, Zoroastrianism, Methuselah, and Israelite, which are narratives derived from Jewish and Christian sources.
So they see it as a complex synthesis.
A complex synthesis created by human intellectual curiosity and spiritual speculation. A sweet cultural speculation, yes, but they argue it is decidedly not a divine foundation for faith.
So how does this separation of din and kultur apply to the various schools of thought, the mezhebs?
Mezhebs are seen as legitimate institutions of scholarly effort. Ijtihad. They are absolutely vital for historical understanding. We must study them to see how incredibly intelligent people like Imam Abu Hanifa or Imam Shafi solved the complex problems of their time using the Quran and the available information. They represent brilliant human effort.
But the danger arises when we use them for identity rather than guidance.
Precisely. We should study how they solved problems, but we should not identify with them, declaring ourselves rigidly as Hanafi or Shafi, as if those names supersede the singular identity of Muslim.
And this path of sectarian identification leads directly to the ultimate warning division, tefrika.
The scholars are crystal clear on this. Taking on names other than Muslim, Sunni, Shia, or the name of a specific mezheb or community, Samat, is viewed as following the path of the people of the book, Eli Kitaplashma.
They argue this is how Judaism and Christianity fractured historically.
Yes. Their schools of thought eventually solidified into separate, competing religions, dividing the community of faith.
So the solution to preventing this fragmentation is found in returning to the absolute unity of the Quran itself.
They cite Ali Imran 103, hold firmly to the rope of Allah altogether and do not become divided. And they interpret this verse contextually, arguing that the structure of the verse implies that if you hold firmly to the rope, which they define as the Quran, the singular, unified, divine guidance, then you will not become divided.
So the Quran provides the necessary, definitive knowledge, the ilm, that's required to resolve controversies and achieve the ultimate unity embodied in La ilaha illallah.
Exactly. Unity is not achieved by compromise between sects, but by universal adherence to the one source of truth.
Okay, we've established that the Quran proponents prioritize the book due to its divine nature and its capacity for unity. But opponents often push back, right? They argue that the Quran is too complex for the layperson. They claim the common believer lacks the necessary expertise in specialized Arabic grammar, mentioning highly technical terms like Sifatul Mushabbeh or knowing the vezin, the meter of the words.
Right. It's a very common defense mechanism for maintaining intellectual control. But the Quran scholars deploy a historical counter-argument that completely undercuts this linguistic exclusivity.
And what's that historical counter-argument?
They ask a simple question. Did the pagans of Mecca, Abu Jahl or Abu Lahab, who were steeped in the darkness of ignorance, the Kahiliya Quranland, did they possess more sophisticated Arabic grammar than today's scholars?
The answer is obviously no.
Absolutely not. Yet they understood the core message of the revelation instantly. Their problem was not comprehension, it was acceptance. The core message of Tawheed, of monotheism, and the requirements of justice were utterly clear to them.
And they also argue that modern linguistic skill doesn't equate to spiritual success. You can be an Arabic expert and still be completely lost.
Precisely. They state, Syrian priests, Lebanese scholars, the entire Arab world possesses deep knowledge of the Arabic language, yet the Muslim world today is suffering, dragging on the ground. The phrase is, yerlerde sur New Yor, afflicted by division and ignorance.
So the issue, therefore, is not curate recitation, reading, or linguistic mastery.
But tilavet, which means following, implementing, or living the text. The command the prophet received was to tilavet the book, to implement its teachings fully in his life and his community.
And this brings us to the Quran's own emphatic claim about its accessibility.
Right. The scholars emphasize that God repeatedly asserts the Quran is easy to understand. They point to Qamar Surah, which repeats the assertion 4 times in a very short span.
And they highlight the grammar of that assertion, don't they?
They point out it uses 3 emphatic particles, wa, lam, and cuddled. Vakad to stress, and we have certainly made the Quran easy for remembrance.
So if God guarantees its ease, then claiming it's too difficult for anyone without a PhD in linguistics is refuted by the divine source itself. So what is the real obstacle to understanding it, according to these scholars?
The real obstacle is duty, it's responsibility. People don't want to understand the Quran because comprehension brings immediate duties. It challenges their complacency. It forces them to face their own shortcomings.
They quote a late scholar saying that people will engage in incredibly hard physical labor. They'll dig, they'll carry heavy weights. But the most difficult act for them is the one the Quran demands most.
Thinking.
The Quran demands active engagement, reflection, and continuous self-correction. And that intellectual effort is what they want to avoid.
And this demand for active engagement brings us to the most critical methodological point. The technical difference in source reliability, or subut, between the Quran and Hadith literature.
This is a fundamental concept for our listener to grasp.
It is. The Quran possesses subutu kati, definite authenticity. It came via tawatur.
Okay, can you explain tawatur?
Tawatur means collective consensus or mass transmission. It's so widespread, so continuous, and so numerous across time and space that falsification is rationally impossible. Think of it like knowing the exact date of Istanbul's conquest, or knowing that London exists, even if you've never been there.
It's preserved in the collective human conscience.
The Mashari Viktan. And crucially, the Quran has no individual narrators, no raveler. The collective body of believers preserved it perfectly, ensuring it carries no doubt. La raybi fi.
Now compare that with hadith, even the so-called sound ones.
Hadith, especially the ahad hadiths, which are transmitted via single chains or limited reports, and that's the vast majority of them, they possess subutuzani, conjectural authenticity.
So not definite, conjectural.
Even the foremost hadith scholars, the Usulu Hadith Biljinleri, freely admit that these reports carries on, which is conjecture, probable knowledge, or strong likelihood, but it is not kati, it is not absolute certainty.
And what underscores this difference?
The fact that hadith relies on human narrators. The different methods and standards used by scholars like Bukhari and Muslim, where one could deem a narrator trustworthy and another could label the exact same narrator a liar of liars, that demonstrates the inherent conjectural nature of the science. The process is a heroic human effort, but it is ultimately human effort applied to probable knowledge. It cannot compete with divine certainty.
And they bring in the historical context to support this prioritization.
Yes. They remind us that the early generations of Muslims, including figures like the Caliph Umar, actively discouraged or even forbade the widespread compilation of hadith. They mention Umar's strict treatment of Abu Huraira and the comparison of the hadith collection process to the Jewish creation of their parallel text, the Mishnah.
And the motivation was simple.
It was simple. It was to prevent any human-authored text from competing with the Quran as the singular source of law and the divine word. And this historical fact confirms methodologically why hadith cannot hold the same qati or definite authority as the Quran.
So if the Quran is qati, definitive truth, and hadith is zan, conjectural knowledge, to place them on equal footing is a fundamental methodological violation.
It's prioritizing zan over qati. It's prioritizing human effort over divine certainty. And the proponents argue that the moment you elevate a cultural artifact of probable truth to the same status as the divine book of definite truth, you introduce fragmentation and doubt into the very foundation of the faith. The Quran alone is the ilm, the knowledge necessary to resolve every controversy.
We have journeyed through some incredibly dense and provocative material today, exploring the theological, historical, and methodological arguments underpinning this movement for Quran Islam, and the fierce resistance it faces from those who see tradition as co-equal with Scripture. The level of detail and scriptural rigor brought forward by these scholars is it's undeniable.
I think the profound theological optimism that underpins their struggle is this. They truly believe the light of the book, the Quran, is emerging and cannot be stopped, despite the centuries of attempts to veil it with parallel scriptures and complex human institutions. They are clinging to the divine promise, Allah nurun tamam la yaktur, God will complete his light even if the opponents hate it.
The ultimate call, then, is to you, our listener, to rigorously examine your own sources of authority. Their message is to cling to the Quran as the sole, ultimate source of guidance, and to reject the invention of parallel scriptures or the deification of any human figure.
Whether those are historical figures elevated by mythology or contemporary leaders making these outlandish theological claims like Hulu.
And this leads us to the final provocative thought that emerges directly from their source analysis, a concept that really demands deep contemplation.
It's that the Quran is not just a guide for the living, it is the ultimate standard of accountability for everyone.
The sources reference the idea that on the day of judgment, all people, and indeed the Prophet himself, will be questioned based on the book.
And if the Prophet Muhammad, the very vessel of the revelation, will be held accountable based on the content of the Quran, that single fact establishes its absolute, undeniable authority over every single other source. Every hadith, every fiqh ruling, every Sufi vision. It is the final, supreme measuring stick for all conduct and all claims, both historical and contemporary.
Hold that thought as you reconsider the vast landscape of religious claims and traditions. If the book judges the messenger, then nothing less than the book should be your ultimate judge.
Thank you for joining us for this essential deep dive.
We'll see you next time.
Welcome to The Deep Dive, the show built to cut through the noise and give you the foundational knowledge you need, and fast.
Today we're tackling a really fierce, almost existential debate in the religious sphere.
We are. And it's all centered on source material a listener shared, which frames this entire argument with a pretty dramatic phrase, the coming disaster.
That phrase alone tells you so much, doesn't it? It really signals the temperature of this whole controversy.
So what's the disaster they're referring to?
It refers to the proponents of what's called Quran Islam. This is the viewpoint that says the Quran is the sole, primary, and sufficient source of religious authority.
And the establishment doesn't like that.
The sources our listener shared make it crystal clear. The traditional religious establishment sees this idea not just as some scholarly disagreement, but as a catastrophic threat to its very structure.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our mission for you today is to really understand the core arguments for why the Quran alone is considered sufficient.
And at the same time, why this viewpoint creates such intense, organized resistance, both historically and, right now.
Right. What we're really dealing with here is a battle over authority. I mean, where does true religious knowledge actually come from?
Precisely. The central tension is between those who say, look, our faith and law have to be built solely on the Quran, the one undeniable divine text.
And the other side.
And those who argue that the Quran is, well, either incomplete or you just can't understand it without these other parallel sources.
Which are things like the hadith, right? The prophet's sayings and actions.
Exactly. The hadith, various historical narratives or riviet, and also the spiritual insights you find in tasawwuf or Sufism.
So if you question those extra sources,
You're questioning the entire establishment that built itself around them for centuries.
to get to the bottom of this, the sources say we have to start at the very beginning, with Prophet Muhammad himself. They suggest he was the first Quran Muslim. What does that even mean, and why is that the foundational claim for this whole idea of sufficiency?
It means that the prophet was a recipient of the religion, not its originator. He was fundamentally guided by the revelation, which is often called the ruh, the spirit.
Okay, so he was being guided, not doing the guiding himself.
That's the argument.
Yeah.
The sources cite some really powerful verses to back this up. They point out that the prophet did not know the book or faith until the revelation came to him.
So the revelation was the active agent. It wasn't just giving him a message, it was actually defining him as a messenger.
That is the core conclusion, yes. He was molded by it. And this establishes the finality, the inviolability of the text.
Right, because the sources bring up that moment when the Meccan leaders tried to negotiate with him.
They did. They basically asked him to either bring another Quran or change this one.
They wanted to compromise on the message, make it fit their existing rules.
Exactly. And the boundary that was set in that moment is absolute. The prophet's response was, essentially, I can't change it. I can't substitute my own words. I have to follow only what's revealed to me.
Or face the consequences.
Or face the punishment of the great day. For proponents of Quran-centric Islam, this is like Exhibit A. It proves that if the prophet himself couldn't alter the text,
Then nobody else can either.
then no scholar, no tradition, no spiritual master can add to it or subtract from it today.
Which, of course, raises a huge question. If the message is so clear, why does it always seem to generate such organized, almost political resistance? Why does a return to the core text threaten these established systems so much?
Because the divine message always challenges human power structures. Always.
It's a pattern.
It's a clear pattern. The sources draw a direct line from the opposition the prophet faced back then to the critics today. They call the modern critics the Qudamedlar, the bigwigs, the power brokers.
And they compare them to the old system of Jahiliyyah, the era of ignorance.
They do. We all know the story. The Meccan leaders offer the prophet everything, right? Money, women, even kingship.
They were trying to buy him off.
And the sources emphasize that the one condition for all of it was that he just stopped bringing the divine messages, because those messages were, in their words, demolishing the Jahiliyyah system.
And that system was profitable for them. It relied on a hierarchy.
Of course. It thrived on making people dependent on idols, on priests, on mediators. The Quran just dismantled that entire structure. It demands singular, unmediated obedience to God.
So the modern parallel is that today's critics are afraid the Quran will overturn what the sources call the contemporary Jahiliyyah.
Absolutely. The resistance today, they argue, is driven by those who benefit from the current structure. They're afraid of the Quran's ability to, activate a person's individual reason and conscience.
Because once people read it for themselves,
They stop needing the middleman. And that overturns systems built on control, whether it's spiritual or financial. The Quran itself challenges the need for anything more. There's that famous verse that asks, is it not enough for them that we sent down to you the book which is read to them?
That's a powerful rhetorical question.
It is. And for them, that's the definitive proof of sufficiency.
Okay, that question brings us straight to the most explosive part of this whole debate, the danger of what these critics call parallel books.
Right.
If the Quran is sufficient, what happens to the massive collections of hadith, riwayat, and Sufi texts that have guided Muslims for centuries?
The worry is that these supplementary texts end up creating a parallel authority. The sources use a really powerful historical analogy here.
What's that?
They compare the hadith collections to the Christian Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John.
Okay, how does that parallel work?
The argument is that the human written records and sayings about Jesus eventually led to the deification of Jesus and, crucially, the sidelining of the original divine message, the Injil.
So the fear is that the hadith are doing the same thing today.
that they are becoming a second source of religion, and in some cases, a more intensely studied source than the Quran itself.
But hold on, what about the traditional argument? I mean, you hear this all the time. You can't practice Islam without the hadith. How do you know how to pray, for example?
And that is the crucial counterargument. The sources tackle it head-on by focusing on the difference between, let's say, historical heritage and religious foundation. This brings us to the concept of subut, which means certainty.
Okay, lay that out for us.
There are two categories of transmission. The Quran was transmitted via tawatur. Think of that as collective, overwhelming, undeniable transmission by huge numbers of people, generation after generation.
So it's absolutely certain, subutu kati.
Exactly. As the Quran says of itself, la raybi fi, without a doubt. It's like proving the Eiffel Tower exists. The evidence is just too widespread to deny.
And the hadith, how were they transmitted?
Most hadith came via ahad. That means singular chains of reporters, or much smaller groups. This makes them, by definition, conjectural. Subutu zani.
So probable, but not certain.
Exactly. They are incredibly valuable as history, as culture, as ethical guidance. But the sources argue they can't be the absolute foundation of religion, or din, because they lack that absolute certainty. You just can't build a structure of absolute belief on something that's conjectural.
I see. The issue isn't that they're useless, but that they've been elevated to a level they can't support.
That's the whole point. And this distinction between Zani and Qadi is what underpins the theological critiques of some really popular sayings.
Sayings that critics believe undermine the core of monotheism.
Right. Now we're shifting from a structural critique to a theological one, especially where these parallel sources are accused of, well, deifying human beings.
Let's talk about a specific example. The sources mention a very famous, very controversial hadith.
Live like lik, lama halake flak. It translates roughly to, if not for you, I would not have created the universe.
That's a huge theological claim.
It's massive.
Yeah.
And the sources reject it completely because it implies that the entire creation of the universe depended on the Prophet Muhammad.
Which would contradict
Sound monotheism. It suggests a created being is a precondition for the Creator's universe. It basically elevates a human to a near co-eternal status, and that undermines the absolute, non-contingent nature of God.
Okay, that's a deep distinction. What about some of the Sufi concepts that are criticized?
Well, the foundational Sufi idea of kuntu kens, I was a hidden treasure, I love to be known, so I created existence, is also dismissed by these critics as theological speculation.
Because it's not from the Quran.
Right. It's often claimed to have been received in dreams or through inspiration, ilham. And while personal inspiration can be powerful, it can't be an absolute source of religious knowledge. It doesn't have that Qadi certainty.
The sources also mention some, what they call disgusting and highly controversial example.
Yes. They bring up claims about the sanctity of the prophet's bodily fluids. Things like claims about the consumption of his urine or feces.
And why are those examples brought up?
The critics argue these stories, which pop up in some secondary sources, are used specifically to elevate the prophet beyond human mortality, to make him seem divine or semi-divine.
Which they see as counterproductive.
And, frankly, degrading. They feel it associates him with superstition rather than with his actual mission of pure monotheism and revelation.
This fear of human deification seems to be directly tied to the issue of control. The sources claim that religious authorities intentionally make the Quran seem complex, difficult to understand.
Because it creates the need for an intermediary. It's a simple formula. If people believe the Quran is too difficult, they have to delegate understanding to a professional class.
But the sources point out that this contradicts the Quran itself.
It does. They point to the verse that's repeated 4 times, that the Quran has been made easy for understanding.
So the difficulty isn't in the text itself, it's being manufactured.
That's the claim. That if the average person understands the text, they're forced to confront what the sources call the hardest thing, thinking. And that reflection challenges the systems they live in. It's like looking in a mirror and seeing your own flaws.
The sources drew a pretty striking historical parallel here.
A very explicit one. They compare this practice directly to the medieval era, when the church and the kingdom forbade common people from reading the gospel in their own language.
To maintain control.
To maintain the absolute control of the clerical class, the Reuben. The critique is that the current religious establishment operates in a similar way. They make themselves the essential interpreters to maintain their authority.
And this structure is what allows for the deepest theological problem the sources identify, the deification of humans through concepts like hulul or tecelli.
This is where the criticism becomes most severe. The claim that God T'Challa, or manifested in a specific living human leader, is seen as just, well, polytheism disguised as piety.
And how do they refute that?
They go right back to the Quran, to the definitive account of Moses demanding to see God.
And what was God's response in that story?
Unequivocal. You shall never see me. And what's more, when God's glory was shown to the mountain was leveled and Moses fell unconscious.
The point being
that this divine refusal is absolute proof that God does not incarnate in living people. They say it's impossible. And they argue that these modern claims of T'Challa create a hierarchy God, then the incarnated leader, then the followers. That dangerously mirrors the Christian model of God, Jesus, church, and priests.
when a movement challenges power and theology this deeply, the response is rarely polite. The sources detail specific slanderous attacks, especially against prominent scholars like Mustafa Islamoglu.
Yes, the Abyss incident is a textbook example of how context can be weaponized against someone.
Remind us of the details.
So, the Surah Abyss opens with the line, "He frowned and turned away." The critics accuse the scholar, the Islamoglu, of calling the prophet arrogant by claiming he was the one who frowned. And this accusation, created massive outrage.
But the sources explain that his actual interpretation was completely different.
Completely. The defense cited in the source shows that the scholar explicitly said the one frowning and turning away was Walid bin Mughir, a polytheist leader who was in the meeting, not the prophet.
So it was a willful misinterpretation.
That's what they accused them of. Taking the opening verse, ignoring the critical explanatory footnote, and creating a false, slanderous narrative that the scholar insulted the prophet when he was actually defending him.
And the sources also mention counter-accusations to show how intense this gets.
Well, yes. To highlight the perceived moral decay of the opposition, they mention a claim that one critic said the prophet engages in sexual relations in the grave.
Which is just a shocking thing to say.
And they immediately refute it with fundamental theology, citing the verse, "We did not grant immortality to any human before you." They emphasize the prophet is mortal and has passed away, and this just shows how far some critics will go to defend their framework.
This has been an incredibly layered deep dive. At the end of the day, it really does seem like this whole fierce debate boils down to an issue of certainty versus conjecture.
That's it. Is Islam defined by the kaki, the certain, undeniable, divine text, or is it defined by a mixture of that text and the zani, the conjectural, human-transmitted history, and spiritual speculation?
And that distinction, that's the critical takeaway.
It is. The proponents of Quran sufficiency argue that relying on zani sources is what inevitably leads to fragmentation. It's why, they say, the Islamic world is divided into countless groups and sects.
And the Quran is the only solution.
The Quran alone, which is described as the rope of God, is seen as the only path back to true unity, or whatnot, because it's the only source everyone can agree is absolutely certain.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, who is just trying to navigate all this and understand the sources?
The sources repeatedly drive home a really profound and provocative point about personal accountability.
Which is?
Your judgment on the day of reckoning will be based on this book. Not on the interpretations of men, not on the authority of masters, not on the traditions you inherited, but on the Quran. Even the prophet will be judged by it.
So if you truly accept that premise,
if you truly accept that this one text is the singular final measure of your faith, then the question you have to grapple with is this: how much of your effort should be dedicated to reading, contemplating, and directly understanding the Quran, instead of delegating that core responsibility entirely to others?
Yeah, and that shift in focus from the intermediary to the text itself.
That is the heart of the coming disaster for those who benefit from the status quo.
Welcome to The Critique. We are diving straight into a submitted piece that makes a passionate case for Quran Islam.
It really does. It argues that God's book is the only source you need, and it strongly pushes back against human narrations and the whole idea of sacralizing human figures.
And that core argument is its biggest strength, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The theological stance is crystal clear. And the use of Quranic verses, you've got Yunus, Shura, Qasas, it's compelling. It really works to frame the Prophet Muhammad as the very first Quran Muslim.
A really, really strong foundation.
Exceptionally strong.
But, and there's a but, while the ideas are there, the way they're presented, it feels a little bit, hard to follow at times.
Which brings us right to our first point. We need to talk about restructuring the argument to maximize clarity and retention.
Yes.
The main message, this crucial point about the Quran's sufficiency, it gets fragmented. It's just buried under so many anecdotes and, frankly, the emotional intensity of the rebuttals.
I felt that too. A kind of rapid transition fatigue. The weakness is that the flow just jumps between completely different topics.
Exactly.
You're reading a major theological point, like the prophet's role as a messenger, and then the very next paragraph is a super specific defense of a contemporary figure.
And then it jumps again to, ancient Gnostic concepts. It's jarring.
And then immediately after that, you're hit with rebuttals to these really crude polemical rumors, things about the prophet's activity in the grave or other bizarre claims.
Right. And that oscillation between high theology and, low-level rumors makes the whole thing feel less like a unified thesis.
And more like a series of reactive Twitter threads strung together.
That's a perfect way to put it. It feels reactive, not proactive.
So here's a question then. The author clearly has to address these things because these are the criticisms that get thrown at this viewpoint. If we suggest tucking them away, are we telling them to just ignore the attacks?
That's a great point. And no, it's not about hiding them. The risk isn't hiding them, it's allowing them to dictate the entire structure of the argument.
Ah, I see.
The core message is just too important to be constantly derailed by every single provocation from outside.
So the suggestion is to impose a kind of hierarchy, to segment the material?
Precisely. We think you should systematize the material, group the similar examples together, and then, reserve those really sensational rebuttals for their own clearly defined section.
Define the movement before you defend it.
Exactly. That prevents the attacks from destabilizing the main theological foundation.
So what would that look like in practice? Can you give some concrete examples?
Sure. I'm thinking of 3 clear zones. First, you establish the theological foundation right at the start.
Okay.
That's where you put all the Quranic verses that support the book's sufficiency. This is where you anchor the whole piece in tawhid, in pure monotheism.
That makes sense. And the second zone would be for the counter-arguments?
Yes. Second, you create a dedicated polemical annex. You can even call it dismantling myths or something. This is where you put the detailed rebuttals.
So all the stuff about Gnostic ideas or claims that undermine the prophet's humanity, that all goes in there.
Exactly. You label it clearly so the reader knows they're stepping into a defense, not the main thesis. It's an appendix, not the introduction.
That seems like the perfect place to handle those specific arguments, like the one about the prophet's death. It's a fight that has to be fought, I get it, but it shouldn't be the headline.
It shouldn't. And third, just to complete it, make sure those more sophisticated discussions like the difference between rizq and etcher for martyrs.
Sustenance versus spiritual reward?
Right. That kind of deep exegesis belongs in the main theological section. If it pops up next to a crude rumor, the reader gets intellectual whiplash. By segmenting, you just elevate the entire argument.
That reorganization brings so much clarity. And, it leads perfectly into our next point, which is about how this is all delivered. It sort of feels like the piece needs to decide if it's a statement of faith or a counterattack.
You've nailed it. That's our second critique. Adjusting the tone from defensive reaction to assertive affirmation. The tone right now is just so defensive. It uses this really combative language. And that risks pushing away listeners who might be looking for positive guidance, not to be recruited into a polemical war.
I absolutely agree. The framing is always a response to attacks. You read phrases about opponents being disturbed or people shouting in chorus. It's constantly on the back foot.
And that defensive posture forces the listener to think about the opposition's weakness instead of the thesis's own strength.
All that energy is spent on tearing down the other side.
It's misplaced energy. When you spend so much time talking about the absurdity of these intellectual barriers people create, like you can't understand the Quran without mastering some obscure grammatical term.
Right.
It just drains the power from your own message. It focuses on the critic's anger, not the reader's joy of discovery.
But let's push back on that for a second. When you're challenging centuries of tradition, you're inherently challenging authority, these tawaghit or false authorities. How do you do that without sounding at least a little combative?
A fair question. The suggestion isn't to stop challenging. It's to shift the perspective. The goal should be to shift the narrative from defending the movement to proactively defining it.
Okay.
We need to convey the conviction, the clarity, the joy of the message. We have to reinforce the idea that this is a powerful, liberating act. The text itself says it wants people to rediscover and fall back in love with the Quran. Lean into that.
So lead with the positive case, not the counter-argument? How does that play out when you do have to deal with opponents?
Well, first, reframe the opening. Emphasize the positive journey of returning to the source, instead of leading with this narrative of impending disaster that the critics are pushing.
And second?
Second, when you cite those examples of intellectual arrogance, the scholars demanding mastery of esoteric terms, focus the critique on the methodological error.
What's the error?
The error is creating artificial barriers to God's message.
It's like telling someone they need to study ancient Greek for 5 years before they're allowed to understand Shakespeare. It turns an open book into a locked fortress.
That's it, exactly. You critique the system that built the fortress, not necessarily every person living inside it. And this applies to historical figures too. Be consistent.
What do you mean?
Treat hadith collectors or sectarian leaders not as these malevolent, personalized enemies, but as products of their historical and sociological conditions.
Right. Which is exactly how the piece successfully analyzed the emergence of Sunnism. It framed it as a political movement born out of the chaos of the early civil wars.
Precisely. That's the key. By analyzing it as a historical consequence, you create intellectual distance. You affirm your thesis without maligning every single person caught up in that system. It lets the reader agree with you without feeling like they've just signed up for an endless war.
That shift is powerful. So if the audience now understands what the movement is, a return to the Quran, and what it sounds like, joyful, not angry, the next logical question is, what does this movement do?
And that takes us to our final and maybe most crucial point, sharpening the so what by defining Quran-centric action. The piece is great at drawing boundaries, at saying what's not an acceptable religious source. But it needs a much clearer, more actionable vision for what adherence to the Quran actually means in modern life.
I agree. The weakness is how much time is spent on negation, on what it rejects, mysticism, human narrations. The actual definition of a Quran generation is, well, it's pretty abstract. It's mostly about thinking and reading.
Correct. It powerfully says the world expects many things from Muslims, but then it doesn't detail what those things are. We need to see the leap from theological purity to real-world impact.
So the suggestion is to define the action, make it concrete.
Yes. We need to dedicate space to showing how a pure focus on the Quran translates directly into positive, visible action, both individually and societally.
You have to connect it back to that original premise, that this message overthrew the entire system of the Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance.
Exactly. Show the listener what a Quran-based life looks like when you apply it to 21st century problems.
The moment where the philosophical rubber meets the moral road. What are some concrete ways to do that?
Well, let's use that great analogy that's already in the text, the one about cultural heritage versus religious source.
The archaeological dig analogy.
That one, it suggests we should treat historical texts, hadith, fiqh, tasawwuf, not as binding law, but as valuable non-binding cultural records. Mirasudar, an artifact from a dig.
History, not doctrine. I get it.
Use that analogy, nail it down, and then immediately pivot to a specific example of Quran-based ethics in a modern context. For example, go straight to economic justice. How does the Quran's rejection of usury inform how we should fight predatory lending today?
Or how does its mandate for fair dealing challenge corporate greed?
Yes. Or even on a smaller scale, rejecting that mentality of always trying to gain the system. Whether it's smuggling goods past customs or just allowing yourself to become cheap, disposable labor for others.
That's so much more powerful. It shows that rejecting false authorities has an immediate, tangible moral outcome. The listener walks away with a mission, not just a list of things they reject.
Absolutely. And then, for the conclusion, you synthesize the critique of La ilaha illallah, rejecting all false authorities, with a direct call to contemporary action. The question needs to be sharp.
Which is?
What specific systems of thought, what social norms in our world today does the Quran demand we dismantle, just like it dismantled the Meccan Kahiliyyah?
So it's about moving beyond just reading the words?
Exactly. The final actionable step is to distinguish between mere qiraat, just reciting the text, and tilava, which means to follow, to embody, and to act upon its demands. That really focuses the so what and gives the listener a clear, modern moral mandate.
This has been incredibly helpful. So, to quickly recap, our 3 key areas for improvement.
First, we said systematize the structure. Create separate, dedicated sections for theology and for polemics to keep that core argument clean and powerful.
Right. Second, we recommended shifting the tone. Move away from that reactive defensiveness and toward a proactive, joyful affirmation. And critique systems, not just people.
And finally, we urge the author to sharpen the practical so what of it all. Give clear, actionable, modern examples of how this Quranic-centric approach leads to real justice and ethical living.
The strength of this material is without a doubt its commitment to the Quran's authority. These suggestions are all about increasing its impact and its ability to connect with an audience that is looking for positive, definitive guidance.
We really encourage you to refine the piece using some of these ideas, and please send it back to us for a future critique. Thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Until next time.
Welcome to the debate. Our discussion today, it really centers on one of the most fundamental questions in faith right now, the absolute authority of the revealed text. We're looking at a sharp critique, one that some have even labeled the coming catastrophe, which is leveled against those who argue for the Quran as the single complete source for belief.
Right.
So the central question for us is this: is the Quran the sole and sufficient text for the faith, requiring us to exclude all secondary narratives as, normative sources? Or are such historical accounts actually necessary for accurate practice and to prevent just arbitrary interpretation? I'll be arguing for the absolute completeness and theological certainty of the Quran, completely independent of these later historical additions.
And I'll be presenting the view that while the Quran is, of course, the primary source, it carries that inherent divine certainty, or qati. The authenticated historical record, especially the prophet's practices, they're indispensable for a comprehensive understanding and for the actual real-world implementation of the divine law. They provide a kind of essential informational scaffolding.
My position really rests on a simple theological premise: divine perfection. The religious message, I would argue, is exclusively and completely contained within the divinely protected text of the Quran. So any reliance on supplementary texts, no matter how well-intentioned, it just inherently undermines this divine completeness. I mean, why would God send a book that requires another human-created book to make it work? The Quran itself states its own sufficiency. In Ankabut 51, it asks, "Is it not enough for them that we have sent down to you the book which is recited to them?" That's a powerful rhetorical question. And look at the prophet's own journey. Surah 52 states very plainly that the prophet did not know what the book was nor what faith was before he received the revelation and was guided by it. So if the highest authority, the messenger himself, was guided solely by the book, well, that proves its sufficiency for everyone who follows. He was commanded to follow the Quran, and he refused to change it, even when his opponents asked him to bring another Quran or change this one. The integrity of the source has to be paramount.
Okay. I do acknowledge the theological gravity of your argument about the Quran's absolute certainty, its qati status. I really do. However, I think you might be creating a false binary here by equating the Quran as the sole source of law, with it being the sole informational source needed for understanding. The lived tradition, the explanations of the prophet, what we call the sunnah, these are indispensable for proper implementation. They serve as essential historical informational sources. And it's crucial here to distinguish between, weak cultural inheritance, which often gets mistaken for religious law, and strong, historically grounded evidence. We absolutely have to discard superstition, but dismissing all historical accounts of the prophet's application, that's essentially rejecting history itself. And no rational person rejects verifiable history.
Mm-hmm.
The complexity comes in because the authenticity of most of these narrations is a probabilistic, what we call zani, compared to the absolute certainty of the Quran. But certain crucial historical facts transmitted through what's called mass transmission, or tawatur. It's like how we know the details of the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. That information achieves a level of certainty, or yaqeen, that is sufficient even though it's outside the Quranic text itself. We need that context for everything from, grammar to legal application.
I appreciate that distinction you're making, but I'm just not convinced the risk that comes with accepting probabilistic information is worth it. The real issue is the inherent unreliability, the danger of allowing these narrations to function as a parallel authority. Once we open that door, we invite fabrication, we invite external legends, Israeliyat, that can dangerously distort core doctrine and, frankly, deify human figures. We have to face the dark side of this. For instance, you have claims in the tradition that the prophet's very body was superhuman, the idea that his bodily waste smelled sweet, or even worse, the theological distortions, like the fabricated narration that the whole cosmos was created for the prophet. Were it not for you, I would not have created the heavens. This suggests God's creation was contingent on a man. This is exactly the kind of theological slippage that is so dangerous. And, historically, there was resistance to this. Early figures deliberately discouraged writing down tradition, comparing it to the Jewish Mishnah, precisely because they feared creating a parallel, distracting body of law.
I see why you think that, but I have to push back on that methodology. You're strategically attacking the weakest, most sensational examples. Let's be honest, these are the ones universally rejected by critical scholarship to discredit the entire tradition of historical preservation.
But they exist.
They absolutely exist, but that's why the intellectual tradition developed this incredibly rigorous science, the critique of narrators, or Rajal science, precisely to filter out the liars and expose those weak narratives. Ignoring all historical narration isn't intellectual rigor, it's just ignoring vital historical evidence that we need for contextualization. The problem, therefore, isn't the historical collection itself. It's the theological abuse of it. The abuse happens when people treat these accounts as if they're, divine inspiration received through dreams or psychic visions. That completely corrupts the method. The focus has to be on distinguishing strong, historically sound evidence from weak, fictionalized stories, not on abolishing the entire historical record just because some of it was fabricated. If we do that, how do we establish any historical context at all?
That's a compelling point for methodological rigor, but I would frame the danger differently. Let's say, for argument's sake, your method can weed out all the liars. Does that method restore divine certainty to what's left? No, it only raises it from doubtful to highly probable. The danger isn't just the methodology, it's the theological corruption that happens when that probabilistic parallel authority gets established. We've seen this before in religious history. Look at early Christianity. The deification of Jesus allowed parallel texts, Matthew, Luke, John, to sideline and even supersede the original revelation. We see this today when modern spiritual movements introduce parallel books, which are then treated as the miracle of the Quran, as if the Quran itself is incomplete or dry without them. The most acute danger, though, is that this leads directly to the doctrine of divine incarnation. When human authority is elevated, you see spiritual leaders claiming that God literally manifested or appeared in a person, and there's a crucial warning against this in the Quran itself, in Araf 143, where Moses couldn't even bear the raw glory of revelation. He collapsed. So how could any mortal claim to be a full manifestation of the divine?
Okay, I acknowledge the grave theological danger there in your critique of spiritual cults that turn guidance into absurdity, like believing you have to cling to a sheikh's coat to achieve salvation. That is entirely valid. The fault there lies squarely with the practitioners, with those who compromise their intellectual integrity. However, we have to view these traditions, like legal interpretation, fiqh, or even spirituality, tasawwuf, in their proper light. They are, fundamentally, cultural institutions created by fallible human effort, by juristic effort and interpretation, to address complex socio-historical problems. They are necessary for intellectual life, and they have to be studied with critical tools, but they should absolutely never be mistaken for divine law. The existence of human efforts to explain the faith shouldn't be used as an argument to abolish all the historical context that frames the prophet's life.
To get a comprehensive understanding, you need both the certainty of the text and the contextual information that history provides.
That is a well-articulated defense, but the practical consequence of relying on these frameworks is that they often become weapons used to silence sincere reform efforts. The very idea of returning to the Quran alone is often met with intellectual aggression. Consider the controversy around interpreting the chapter of Abbaset. He frowned and turned away. You have reformers who use rigorous analysis to suggest the subject was a wealthy pagan leader, not the prophet, and they are slandered for it. Their opponents claim they called the prophet arrogant when the commentary was based on solid historical evidence. This shows that those who champion tradition often weaponize historical ambiguities against anyone who wants to make the Quran the primary source again. It's a defense of institutional power, not necessarily truth.
The abuse of intellectual tools and arguments it's lamentable, but that doesn't invalidate the need for context. Relying solely on a literal, decontextualized reading ignores the Quran's own internal complexity. You mentioned the Quran insists it's been made easy, and you're right, the chapter of the moon says it 4 times. But, and this is the key point, accessibility does not equate to mastery. Even the Prophet's primary role of following and reciting the Quran requires intense intellectual engagement, deep reflection, which the Quran demands over and over, and that reflection requires context. A sophisticated understanding can't be achieved by fearing and dismissing the historical information that frames the meaning of specific terms, rulings, and rhetorical structures. We aren't arguing for tradition over the text, but for historical fidelity in order to understand the text accurately.
I have to reiterate the fundamental division here. We agree on intellectual engagement, but if the quest for historical fidelity introduces probability or God-provided certainty, it compromises the entire structure of the faith. The Quran is the only source protected by God. We have to prioritize this divine certainty and be wary of cultural systems that turn faith into a cultural religion or lead to us becoming like the people of the book, who relied so heavily on their parallel, human-written texts they lost the original revelation. We've seen the dangers of elevating human opinion over the undeniable absolute word of God.
And I agree completely on the need to reject slander and the dangers of deification. However, the intellectual path forward, it demands a rigorous assessment of all historical data. We have to avoid mistaking complexity, which requires historical context, for a rejection of the divine text. The ongoing challenge is precisely this: distinguishing the eternal, certain word of God from the fallible human efforts to explain it. So the path of truth, it seems to me, requires both the absolute certainty of the book and the diligent, critical effort to understand its proper application across human history.
And I think this discussion really reinforces that critical point. Discerning truth requires engaging with all the available evidence while always maintaining an unwavering commitment to the singularity and the certainty of the divine message itself.
Indeed. There is much more intellectual terrain to explore here, and that dialogue between historical fidelity and textual certainty, it remains profoundly open.